9 a.m. with me, and I'm Akshay Tandon. Our top focus this morning is President Trump's address to the Congress, the first address he gave to the joint Congress at night, which is early, of course, India morning, where he did mention the campus shooting. He did admit to the rising hate crimes in his country. After days of silence, he finally condemned the shooting of the Indian in campus. In his bid to renew the true American spirit, Trump appeals for unity, but defends his executive orders of building the wall along the border, the south border he did mention, and also the ban of immigrants from 7 Muslim countries. Vouches to demolish ISIS, crack down on radical Islamic terrorism. Those were the big takeaways from President Trump's speech this morning when he gave an address to the joint session of the Congress. Let's take a listen in.
Of American greatness is now beginning. A new national pride is sweeping across our nation, and a new surge of optimism is placing impossible dreams firmly within our grasp. What we are witnessing today is the renewal of the American spirit. Our allies will find that America is once again ready to lead. Recent threats targeting Jewish community centers and vandalism of Jewish cemeteries, as well as last week's shooting in Kansas City, remind us that while we may be a nation divided on policies, we are a country that stands united in condemning hate and evil in all of its very ugly forms.
Let's break this down for our viewers joining us on this broadcast this morning. I have with me Mr. Bharat Karnal, Strategic Affairs Expert, joining us live. I also have our colleague, Foreign Affairs Editor, Geeta Mohan, joining us from the studio. And we have with us Professor Sumit Ganguly, Professor of Political Science at Indiana University, joining us via Skype. A very good morning to all of you. Thank you very much for coming in. A quick start with you, Mr. Bharat Karnal. Sir, your first thoughts and takeaways on President Trump's speech today. A lot was expected on what he had to say about the hate crimes in this country. He did begin with that, but that's all. He just mentioned so in his beginning speech.
Well, look, most State of the Union addresses are high on rhetoric, very low on programmatic substance. So that was expected. After all, this is his inaugural address to the nation as president. So there were some high-sounding ideas and so on that are basically a repetition of the themes that he had developed and that he won the elections with. He did not in any sense depart from them. But the problem is that he has promised so much to so many people. Where is the money? Where is the money to do all these things and also cut taxes and also look after alliances and do everything else? One thing that I think India has to worry, along with every other nation in Asia and the rest of the world, is that in trade matters he's going to become, it's going to be a closed market.
Right.
All kinds of, if Trump believes that any kind of trade deal is unfair to America, he's going to shut it down.
Absolutely.
In our case, we are, exporting services and so on. The H-1B visas. There's no give so far from the Trump administration. It hasn't even been acknowledged. Indeed, it's been reiterated that the H-1B visas cannot be, will not be enlarged, that program. If anything, is going to be constricted. The family reunification aspects of any kind of visas, including H-1B, is going to be very carefully monitored. In fact, it might end up, he might end up cutting off that entire channel of letting in people on the family reunification basis. And that's going to hurt many of the Indian aspirants who really are drawn to America because they can bring in the extended family and so on, as has happened in the past. Indian aspirants who really are drawn to America because they can bring in the extended family and so on, as has happened in the past, 50-odd years. That particular channel is going to close.
Okay. Well, stay with us, please, sir. I'll also bring in Professor Ganguly right now. Your thoughts on what President Trump had to say and how is it being received? Of course, we spoke of that. He spoke of how hire in America and make in America is going to be the priority, and that is something he's been speaking of all through the campaign as well. How is this being really received in his first address to the Congress today? Professor Ganguly.
Well, it was mostly consistent with his campaign rhetoric. I didn't see a significant departure from his campaign rhetoric. However, I was heartened somewhat to see that he actually made a nod towards a spate of violence and racial hatred that has characterized this country over the last month. I was a bit disappointed that he only made a cursory reference to the episode in Kansas. It was a reference merely passing, but it was nevertheless preferable to his deafening silence of the last several days.
That's right.
The other elements in his speech were fairly predictable. There was nothing unusual about them. The only difference was that instead of his inaugural address, where he presented a dystopian vision of America, this was a much more upbeat vision of America.
Professor Ganguly, we'll have to patch that line again with you. We're having some issues with the audio line, though of course we can see you, but just be with us for a couple of moments. I want to go back to our colleague Geeta as well, joining us in the studio. Geeta, the message is very clear. You see, like President Trump said while he was addressing everybody, it's not about the world. He's not talking and thinking of himself as a world leader. He's thinking of a person who's been elected by the American people, and he's there for America. So priority is going to be America in every way possible.
Well, that's right, and we were having this conversation earlier, Akshay, that while U.S. presidents are known to be beacons of the free world, are considered world leaders, here is a president who comes and says, I'm not president of the world,
right.
I'm president of the United States of America. And that clearly shows what his focus is going to be.
True.
And he is going to focus on America. He is going to focus on what he thinks is priority, and which is prioritizing jobs for Americans and looking at changing the immigration policy to suit what he calls the Americans.
Right. Let me go back to Mr. Karnad. Sir, in your view, in what President Trump has just said today, how is it likely really going to impact when it comes to diplomatic relations with America? Of course, we've spoken a lot about the H-1B visas and all the changes that are being brought in, but, you know, where immigration is also concerned, this turns out to be a very key issue. Priority, of course, is America. He's also spoken of how exports, like you also pointed out, the priority is to make in America, where overall relationships are concerned with the United States of America, and if I may, the balance of power, do you see that shifting where India's alliance is concerned vis-a-vis West and the East?
I think the Modi government will have to now seriously reconsider. As I've been saying for many, many years, all the countries of the world, major countries of the world, are turning inward.
Yeah.
They are turning nationalistic. The fact that Trump's America is doing so as well is not a great surprise. It's just that we have now discovered globalization 30 years too late. So we are always at the back end of the learning curve. I mean, that's been my theme in my books and so on. Now, what is the problem? The problem is this. The Americans and Trump administration is not going to be any different. They will be happy to sell you more and more weapon systems, high-value things, and so on and so forth. But they'll be damned if they're going to disadvantage themselves by selling you technology. They want you to be a perennial customer. Now, this is the kind of stuff that the Modi government doesn't seem to quite appreciate. They think that India has leverage by simply buying some C-17s or some F-16 very antique planes and stuff like that from America. It doesn't give you any leverage. He has made it very clear. And yet now Modi is going to go in May to say what? Demand what? He'll be left, reduced to begging for more H-1B visas.
Right.
I mean, one has to have perspective of which way the world is moving. which way the United States is moving, but our media, our people here don't seem to understand that at all. Our middle class doesn't seem to appreciate the changing American reality or the international reality for that matter. So we are in a unique situation where we'll have to end up working for ourselves and not be part of someone else's security architecture or political architecture for the region and so on. Because as he has made clear.
But Mr.
he has
Kanan,
said
isn't
all
that gradually
NATO
also
Asian
changing? I mean, since the
partners,
last 2.5
allies,
years within
whatever,
our country,
will have
don't you
to
think the
pay up.
focus is also changing within India, where we're understanding gradually, of course it will take some time since we have been so dependent on so many ways on Western countries, that it is about making your own country first, it is about independence, it is about, being self-reliant, and that sort of sentiment is being gradually, propagated by this regime in India.
No, I'm afraid not. You see,
Okay.
rhetoric is one thing. When you talk about Make in India and so on, look at the basic. My field is foreign military policies. Look at the Make in India where the defense sector is concerned. It's just buy. Make in India is just another word for licensed manufacture. It's just screwdriver technology. It's not designing weapons. It's just making some old hardware that some countries have phased out. The F-16 is 1970s, 60s aircraft. Late 60s designed aircraft. You're now going to build it here. This is the kind of flagship enterprise that ends up hurting the Indian economy and will end up hurting the Indian interest. Though, I must say,
Yes.
Trump will be very happy for Lockheed to sell more and more of these kinds of
I mean, let's not forget he is a
items to
businessman
India.
after all, isn't he, who is now the President of the United States. Professor Ganguly, coming back to you now, I think we had that line connected. You were, of course, making a point of how people are accepting this speech. It's not very different from the campaign speech President Trump really had. We saw that bitter campaign with Hillary Clinton. But is this just rhetoric? Is it just about playing it to the galleries, or do you think America is in a position to be able to do all that Trump is actually saying? Because we've seen how America is also such an open economy in so many ways, interdependent on the economies of China, the kind of investment China has seen in America as well. Saying it for the galleries is one, but practicality and the aspect of actually doing it, ground realities could be very different. How do you see this, Professor Ganguly?
There are serious contradictions in his claims, because on the one hand, he wants to spend about $1 trillion in infrastructure, and at the same time, he wants to expand the defense budget by $54 billion. He wants to pursue building this wall with Mexico.
Right.
But and at the same time, a Republican Congress wants to limit the budget and is keen on balancing the budget. And quite frankly, the economics just don't make any sense. He's suggesting that America will grow at a very rapid clip and thereby more revenues will be generated. But it is not entirely clear how you put a mature economy on such a growth path that it can grow at 3 to 4% annually. This has never happened in history, and while he can make these rhetorical flourishes, the practical realities of economics are get in the way. So I just don't know how he's going to accomplish many of these things that he's stating.
Okay.
The next 6 months will really tell, because I frankly don't see how he can pursue increased defense spending on the wall along the U.S.-Mexican border, and at the same time expand the infrastructure spending and balance the budget. This is just an impossible task that he has set for himself.
Okay, it's an impossible task he set for himself. Do stay with us, please, Professor Ganguly. Geeta, coming back to you and talking about where we stand right now. We have the Foreign Secretary is also visiting the United States. We were thinking of how the issue of campus killing will be spoken of. Of course, immigration issues will be taken up as well. But President Trump, in his address today, has actually addressed those issues, and we know clearly where the American administration stands on these.
Well, that's That's right. We know that it's a bit late, and that the White House officials off the record were saying that they wanted the FBI to first determine and call it a hate crime, say that it was actually racially motivated, for to first determine and call it a hate crime, say that it was actually racially motivated for President Trump or for the White House to then put out an official release. But we saw many other leaders, including Hillary Clinton, come out and say that despite and in spite of what the FBI says or doesn't say, it is the duty of the president to come out and make a statement on a case such as the Kansas shooting. And in that, President Trump, though delayed, has come out and made a statement. There has been condemnation from the White House, but there has been no mention, and Bharat was very right in saying that why should President of the United States of America speak to a constituency that is India or Indians in the United States of America, when the whole point is that he has an entire domestic constituency on the basis of whom he was riding his entire election campaign, and is the reason why he was also very careful in making that statement. And there was no strong statement against hate crimes or zero tolerance towards any racist attack.
Indeed, do stay with us, please, gentlemen, as well as Geeta. We'll take a listen into a couple of more sound bites of President Trump, and we'll carry on with our discussion.
We must support the victims of crime. I have ordered the Department of Homeland Security to create an office to serve American victims. The office is called VOICE, Victims of Immigration Crime Engagement. We are providing a voice to those who have been ignored by our media and silenced by special interests. Joining us as promised, I directed the Department of Defense to develop a plan to demolish and destroy ISIS, a network of lawless savages that have slaughtered Muslims and Christians and men and women and children of all faiths and all beliefs. We will work with our allies, including our friends and allies in the Muslim world, to extinguish this vile enemy from our planet.
Okay, let's now further take this to the issue of terrorism. Mr. Kannad, if I could come to you. ISIS, of course, is one issue that all Western countries are trying to deal with together. Even when they deal with it, we are looking at differences of opinion, as we saw between Russia and America and the other countries here. But the fact that President Trump chose to spoke of IS and how they want to demolish it, this is the same thought that has continued even during the Barack Obama regime as well. And every country would want to see IS demolished. But will America really walk the talk? Because it, of course, has to safeguard its own interests first. It is about safeguarding America. President Trump also said, Mr. Kannad, that we have been protecting the borders of other countries while leaving our own vulnerable of sorts. How far do you see this administration of America taking forward the issues of other countries when it comes to fighting terror?
Let's be very clear. It's not just a Trump initiative. It's always been the U.S. government's position to back its interests in terms of the terrorists the U.S. government has identified as being inimical to U.S. interests.
Right.
They're not interested in, safeguarding Indian interests in terms of targeting terrorists like the Lashkar-e-Taiba or some other gang of the terrorist gangs somewhere or the other. Acting and on behalf of the masters wherever against Indian interests. So let's again be very clear. The Trump administration is not going to be very different from the Obama administration, which was not very different from the George W. Bush administration and previous regimes. Everybody's focused essentially on targeting those who work against their own national interest.
Yeah. Okay, I think we've lost the line with Mr. Kannad. We'll connect with him once again. Professor Ganguly, on how America is now going to take the issue of terrorism forward. He did speak of Muslims. We've seen during the campaign how he was trolled across the media and by several people of the kind of stand he took against Muslims. Now when he does come forward, he gives an address to the joint session of the Congress over there. The fact he chooses to mention IS, he chooses to also mention about, we'll come to that as well, about, women entrepreneurs. It seems President Trump is trying to undo all the wrong that he has done while addressing people in his campaign. He spoke of the judiciary as well. He spoke of women as well. He spoke of Muslims too. Do you think this was yet another attempt on trying to undo all that he has done in the past few months? Professor Ganguly?
These are fairly minor efforts on his part to undo some of the damage that he has inflicted on himself. But I don't see these as significant departures. I see these as mostly cosmetic gestures on his part. I do not see them as a fundamental departure from his previous views. Just throwing away a line about women entrepreneurs, saying that he's going to work with Muslim allies, really does not reassure me in any significant way. If he had backed away from his executive order, which had sought to limit refugees from 7 Muslim countries, then I would have said, yes, this constitutes a significant change of heart. But for the most part, I think these are superficial gestures on his part and does not really represent a fundamental embrace of a new policy.
Well, Shamit, is there a departure at all, so to say, because we're looking at a president who for the first time talks about radical Muslim terrorists. He's mentioned them as Muslim terrorists. No other president in the past has spoken about radical Islamic terrorism, so to say. President Barack Obama stayed away from this term. He has done that. And now, while talking about allies, maybe he's trying to gain strength in the argument that he tries to make.
Yes, it's entirely consistent with his earlier rhetoric in that he still talks about Muslim terrorists. He doesn't have a word to say about the terror that a number of white supremacist groups have unleashed in this country since he came to office. There was not even a hint of that in his speech. So, because in some measure, those groups constitute parts of his constituency, and consequently, he's not going to condemn them publicly in his first address to Congress. So, while there are shifts of nuance and elements of subtle changes, the basic tone remain unchanged as far as I'm concerned.
Right. Professor Ganguly, do you think after this month and a half, almost 2 months of President Trump taking over the Oval Office over there and the realities on the ground, the sentiment amongst people, I'm just taking the cue from what happened about 4 or 5 days ago at the Oscars as well, when a strong message was really sent out to President Trump. There have been other instances too. There is a huge section within America that is, if I may put it like that, anti-Trump policies. Now, there is a massive divide amongst the people within America too on what this administration has to offer. Evident, of course, in the Congress as well, when a lot of people do not even choose to stand, give an ovation or clap on all that President Trump was saying. All this that was put forward today, Professor Ganguly, is it out of touch with ground reality where half of America seems to be against what Trump policies are, like Obamacare, like immigration? What do you have to say on that front?
Oh, there's no question about it that we are currently a deeply divided nation. Bear in mind that only 25.5% of the eligible electorate voted for him. He won the election by a mere 70,000 votes in 50 states. Consequently, there is no getting away from the fact that he faces a deeply divided electorate. More to the point, I think there is a degree of buyer's regret amongst a certain segment of the population that voted for him, because suddenly they are beginning to realize that the Affordable Care Act that had significantly improved their lives might be taken away from them. The people For example, coal miners in parts of the United States who had voted for him suddenly recognize the significance of the Affordable Care Act to their lives.
Right.
People who are on Medicare and Medicaid who voted for Trump suddenly realize that Trump's compatriots in Congress might want to significantly realize that Trump's compatriots in Congress might want to significantly shrink these programs. Consequently, even those who voted for him now are having second thoughts.
Mr. Karnat, this divided America that we are looking at today, of course, there have been voices of dissent in the previous administrations as well, but this divided America is extremely exposed today on the choices it really had to make. How do you see this having any bearings, if at all, where relationships with the other countries are concerned, decision-making is concerned, because a lot that President Trump and his administration today are doing is not going down very well with its current allies, and the enemies before are only turning out to be staunch enemies further?
Look, I think the isolationist impulse in America that has come to the fore with Trump's election has always been there. America has always teetered between, being active on the international front and being isolationist, withdrawing to garrison America, fortress America, and so on. Now, in some sense, I think Trump reflects precisely that impulse. That said, I think, if I may just go back to the international Islamic terrorism and so on.
Yes, please.
The really curious thing about the U.S. government's mentioning the 7 nations that have been targeted immigration-wise, refugees and so on, is that the main culprit country has gotten away scot-free. That's Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the locus genesis of all Sunni extremist radicalism that has spread in the world, including in India. Kerala has been communalized with the kind of so-called charitable monies coming in from the Gulf, all funded by Arab Sunni charities to propagate Wahhabi Islam. Wahhabi Islam is at the center of the so-called extremist radical Islamic terrorism. So how come the U.S. government, even before Trump, and now Trump, who has said that he's very much more candid about this threat to the United States, not talked about it?
Indeed.
That's because to the United States, Saudi Arabia is a gold mine. It buys all the military hardware.
True.
Its oil fields are America's to exploit, and so on, the Aramco company. Right. So this is the reality behind all policies, U.S. policies, and not just Trump's policy.
Okay, appreciate that thought. I request you to please stay with us, Mr. Karnat, Professor Ganguly and Geeta. We have to slip into a very tiny breather, but we'll be back discussing more on the speech of President Trump in the joint session of Congress in just a couple of moments. Stay with us. Thanks for staying with NewsX. I'm Akshay Tandon. We continue to discuss and understand what President Trump had to say while he was addressing the joint session of the Congress's first address after being elected as the President of the United States. A lot of mention on how he continues to build on the American dream, also speaking on radical Muslim terrorism as he did. But let's take it forward with our panelists this morning. I have with me Mr. Karnat as well as Professor Ganguly and my colleague Geeta Mohan as well. But before that, we'll take a quick listen in on the issues he mentioned on Obamacare and the military budget, so on and so forth.
Obamacare premiums nationwide have increased by double and triple digits. As an example, Arizona went up 116% last year alone. Governor Matt Bevin of Kentucky just said Obamacare is failing in his state, the state of Kentucky, and it's unsustainable and collapsing. 1/3 of the counties have only one insurer, and they're losing them fast. They are losing them so fast. They're leaving. And many Americans have no choice at all. There's no choice left. Remember, when you were told that you could keep your doctor and keep your plan, we now know that all of those promises have been totally broken. Obamacare is collapsing, and we must act decisively to protect all Americans. I am sending Congress a budget that rebuilds the military, eliminates the defense sequester, and calls for one of the largest increases in national defense spending in American history. My budget will also increase funding for our veterans. Our veterans have delivered for this nation, and now we must deliver for them.
All right, let's go across to our panelists. Professor Ganguly, we'll start with Obamacare. Bring us a little more insight on how much did it continue to really bleed America, and the fact that President Trump has been against Obamacare from the very beginning of his campaign. He did speak of bringing about new policies as well. In a way, it seems like it's going to be a makeover of sorts where Obamacare is concerned.
He's claiming that there is going to be a makeover, but he's been very short on specifics, other than mentioning that pre-existing conditions would be covered and that we would be able to buy insurance across state lines. He has not really given us a clear outline of how his plan will be superior to the Affordable Care Act. The Affordable Care Act had its flaws, but I think its flaws have been greatly exaggerated by the Republicans, and even after years of attempting to undermine it, they still cannot seem to be able to come up with a coherent alternative plan. And consequently, I remain deeply skeptical of Mr. Trump's claims that he has this magical solution that is going to lower our costs, enhance our choices, and bring us affordable care.
Okay. All right. You still remain extremely skeptical on how he's going to go about it. Mr. Karnad, this entire American dream, the perception that the American administration for decades has built for its people, on which, of course, people continue to vote for a new president, how far do you think President Trump, based on what he has said today, based on his campaign, is really going to be successful in renewing, in rebuilding this American dream? Mr. Karnad.
No, look, it's a different variety of American dream that he has put forward. There's the American dream is not the all welcoming, inclusive dream. He has defined a more isolationist, reduced, narrowed down America with a perspective that's constricted. So that's what we have to live with for the next 4 years and perhaps the next 8 years. Now the problem is this: when Trump says that he's going to he's demanded an increase in the defense budget. Now, his increase that he has demanded is about $54 billion, except in the $54 billion amounts to little, very little, when you consider that the U.S. defense budget is almost $700 billion. Yeah. When you have $700 billion, the $54 additional billion is almost $700 billion. Yeah. When you have $700 billion, the $54 additional billion he's demanding will be given to him. It's no big deal. But will that be able to do the sorts of things in terms of maintaining an expansive presence in Asia, for instance? Just to give an idea of how much the costing is going to undermine these kinds of plans that Trump may have, I really don't think so. He's going to begin. But let's say we accept his rhetoric of an expanded role, or at least sustaining the present role in Asia. A 304-ship Navy that he wants, the price tag is, again, in excess of $800 billion. $800 billion. Yes. Now, how does the arithmetic work out? It doesn't. Not for the Americans, not for anybody else. For us, the lesson is that we have to rely on ourselves. We will not be able to have the crutch of an outside power to deal with China, for instance. This is something that our people don't seem to get into our heads.
Okay. Okay. Geeta, closing comments from you on how do you think now the Indian government has to really take this forward? I asked a question initially in our discussion of does India have to gradually now start thinking east, the east policy, as the NDA administration has also been speaking of. It's not the west but the east, looking at how America is now also changing, evolving in its policies and vis-a-vis its outlook towards the world. Geeta.
Well, there is a look east policy that the Modi administration has been pursuing, but like Bharat Karnad said, there has to be a realignment on how India wants to pursue its foreign policy per se, and not depend on a country such as America, which is closing, which is not all-inclusive, and is thinking more for America. And why should India then be dependent on those countries? We will have to start looking at how we should look at aligning ourselves with other countries to ensure that we have a place in the region, as also ensure that in terms of foreign policy, we balance it out between the West and the East.
All right, we'll have to leave it at that, gentlemen. Professor Ganguly from the Political Science Department at Indiana University, Mr. Bharat Karnad, Strategic Affairs expert, and Geeta Mohan. Appreciate you all coming in this morning and sharing your thoughts on President Trump's speech. Thank you very much.